Hello and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today. I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Clibbery, co-founder and CEO at Engineius. Chris, nice to speak to you again.
Yeah, nice to speak to you as well, Kate.
Chris, today you and I are going to be discussing charging infrastructure, costs and the path to net zero. So let's kick off by exploring the cost of electric vehicles, which are often cited as a barrier to EV adoption. But what advice would you give to fleet operators who are concerned about this?
Well, I think, Kate, the first bit of advice that I'd give is to look at the required application. So for what purpose is the vehicle being used? Where and when are you going to use it? How often are you going to use it? How far do you want to go? So it's all around looking at that application. You know, you want to choose the suitable mode of transport, the suitable vehicle for what you want to do. So that would be the first thing.
Right.
The second thing for me would really be to look at the total cost of ownership. You really need to do your homework. So, you know, what are your savings going to be for charging versus buying fuel? What are your savings on maintenance going to be? You know, are there any reductions in the infrastructure price? Do you do a lot of parking? So is parking going to cost you less? And then obviously there are some downsides as well. So there's a lot of talk about insurance at the moment. Are your insurance costs going to go up? But it's really about finding out that total cost of ownership. So relating to the application that you want to use the vehicle for, what are your total cost of ownership? And then you'd start looking at the best method of ownership then. So, you know, is ownership versus contract hire and lease, is that the best way for you to go? You know, is it personal or is it business? Do you want contract hire and leasing, or will salary sacrifice work for you? So you need to work out what is the least cost of ownership for both you and obviously the user applicable to the application. It might be that, you know, you're a large fleet, and obviously if you're a large fleet, it's very different. You'll have purchasing power yourself. Whereas if you're a smaller fleet, then obviously you might be relying on the buying power of a provider, either your own contract hire and leasing company, or maybe some other options that you want to look at for that ownership. And I think lastly, what I would say is that take reference. Do not be afraid to ask.
Yeah.
You've got your providers. You know, you might have somebody who provides already, but benchmark with others. Talk to other people about their experiences. Talk to other companies who have gone through this and have learned from it. I think what you'll find, someone who's good at it and made a success, they're more than happy to talk about their experiences. So why not ask them? You know, British Gas, a bit of a leading light in electric vehicles. Go and talk to British Gas. Ask about their experience.
Yeah.
Talk to who their provider is. Talk to the contract hire and leasing company that they use. So, and then obviously there are a number of fleet experts out there as well. So don't be afraid to talk to the fleet experts. They might want to charge you for in-depth advice, but I'm sure they'll give you a lead in and point you in the right direction. So don't be afraid to ask.
I think it's great advice, Chris. And we have at GreenFleet, we feature a lot of case studies.
Yes.
We've definitely heard from British Gas. We frequently feature Mighty, who have electrified 3,500 of their vans. The AA are working in this area. Who else? Royal Mail is another big one. I think you mentioned a National Grid, of course.
Network Rail are just going
Network
through the process
Rail,
as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you possibly can, look at these companies, see what they've done, what approach have they taken, what's worked well for them, what hasn't worked for them. And when you were talking about, is it outright purchase versus leasing? Very interesting discussion, because the market is very much split on this and always has been. But the current challenges with residual values on some of the electric vehicles kind of makes me think, I would sway towards a lease vehicle to try and mitigate some of that risk.
I think you've got to think about size when you're thinking about that as well, and your attitude towards risk in terms of that. And obviously the bigger you are, then probably, the more you can take that outright purchase decision, because that risk for you is spread over a number of years and you've got a larger number of vehicles. Whereas, if you're slightly smaller, then probably looking at some kind of option where somebody else is owning that vehicle and taking that risk is probably, is probably the route that you're probably going to go.
Yeah.
But learn from what others have done. Yes, exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned TCO. Another question is, should that TCO include the charging infrastructure? And what advice would you give to fleets about assessing the best charging strategy for their operations?
Yes, it definitely should include that. We would include fuel if we were doing a total cost of ownership. So charging should be no different in terms of that. But again, what I would say is go back and look at the required application. For what purpose is the vehicle being used for, where, when, and how often are you going to have to charge it, or is your staff member going to have to charge it? What does that fit in their working day? How does that work for them in their working day? Is it going to hinder their working day, their productive working day, especially if they're doing lots of miles? But the thing I would say is that obviously home charging, if home charging works for you, that's what you should do, because that's going to be both the cheapest and the most efficient way and the easiest way of getting that vehicle charged. So if home charging works, that's great. But then if you do have to venture out into the public charging network, and that is something that a lot of people are scared of. But if you are going to do that, then equip your staff for doing it. Come up with a company guide. Tell them the do's and don'ts of the public network. Make sure that the payment method that they're going to pay with is agreed, and that you've got a proper reimbursement scheme for them. There's a lot of infrastructure fear at the moment. And it's not only about the range of the vehicle, it's about the reliability of the infrastructure as well. So, the planning of a journey, you wouldn't go on the first train journey not knowing where you're going to get your connection and where your second train journey is. So why would you do it in a car if you knew you only had a certain range? There's lots of mapping aids out there, and there's lots of apps that help you with this. Just make sure that your staff are equipped for that. And then I also think that what you should do is make sure your staff know what's going to happen if it goes wrong. So if they do run out of charge, and it does happen, and we know it happens because I have it with my Engineius drivers running out of charge. Not necessarily their fault all the time. Sometimes it is their fault because they've taken a chance that they shouldn't have done. They've thought that I am going to run it right down, which obviously they shouldn't have done. Always make sure you've got enough charge to get to the next charging station. But if it does, and that can be, it can happen. The weather is worse. It's colder, so the range isn't quite what you thought it was going to be. So where do they get help? How do they get out of that situation? It's not the end of the world. It's just like breaking down. The breakdown organisations have infrastructure to be able to help you, whether that's towing you to a charging station, whether it's a mobile charger, which a number of them have got now, but just equip your staff for what's out there.
Yeah. I mean, Chris, I'm an EV driver, and it actually fills me with horror, the thought of actually running out of charge. I think it's much more likely that you get stranded at a charge point that isn't working, and you haven't got enough range to get you to the next available charge point. But again, to have that clearly communicated to your drivers, so that they know you don't just keep driving and pray. If you think you're going to be stranded, then sit tight where you are, and it's much easier to call someone out to the charge point or to effect a repair. But okay, so anyway, after that horror story, let's go a little bit wider. What are the other ways that fleet operators can reach net zero operations?
So I think this goes back to, we all talk about mobility these days, and we all talk about mobility solutions, but it does go back to, you haven't got a transport policy anymore. You haven't got a car policy. You end up with a mobility solution. And it's about what that mobility solution is for your business. So I always go back to the application and the need. So look at the application and the need. Where is a car appropriate, and where can other things actually substitute that? So a pool car is an option if a lot of movements between your offices up and down the country. So can pool cars be used? What's your threshold for company cars? The business need versus perk. Consider the practicalities of public transport. When can public transport actually help you? Is there really a need for a car? So, and we all know that, the least harmful way of doing things is for us actually to walk. but then we've got bike, then we've got bus, then we've got train, you know, so consider those options and do they work for you? And when they don't work for you, Kate, just think about the practicalities of whether you want your staff to be in a car that you know is more environmentally friendly than what they would go out and buy. So the cash option isn't always the right option.
No, absolutely not. I mean, GreenFleet is notorious for being older, less environmentally friendly vehicles. Chris, I was going to ask you because you mentioned public transport. I've spoken to yourself and other people at Engineius multiple times, but your own business model is based on your employees using public transport, which is much easier said than done. So you're obviously doing something right. You know, how do you get that to work?
I think it's all about the planning, really, to be honest with you, and it's about, you know, understanding what the needs are. So obviously, you know, our drivers in particular, they're out there every day in all weathers and they're driving all kinds of different vehicles. So they experience electric vehicles from very early on, and the infrastructure obviously was not great. The infrastructure is getting better. So, but from our point of view, it's about trying to keep the driver in the vehicles and moving as much as possible. But obviously we have travel to the first vehicle, between vehicles, and at the end of the vehicle, and we'll use public transport for that. The drivers will use public transport and they will look at the best means of them doing that, and they have to rely on that public transport. But all of that is about planning and having a backup plan as well. So a driver, when you talk to them, you know, if the train doesn't turn up, what's he going to do? Can he wait for the next train? Has he got to go via somewhere else? But they will use whatever infrastructure is there. So if the train's not running, they'll go and get the bus. And in fact, quite often they'll get the bus before the train because it's cheaper on the bus. Yeah.
And that's financially advantageous for them to do that.
Yeah, exactly. They'll have more money in their pocket at the end of the day. So exactly right.
Yeah. Great. Well, Chris, it has been a pleasure talking to you again. Thank you very much for your insight today. And thank you for Engineius for joining GreenFleet Talks.
Pleasure as always, Kate.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for watching. Please tune into GF365 again soon.